Hi, intro students. I wanted to do a quick recap of Vik Muniz and give you, you've watched the video, so I wanted to just highlight some things and things that I think are strong and important, especially when we start thinking about material having meaning. He's a contemporary artist, living artist, and I think he does a really nice job of complicating some of the modernist themes we've been talking about, especially when it comes to representation versus real, life as art, art mimicking life, the illusion, representation, and kind of breaking down how material carries meaning in terms of representation and interpretation. So, here's the video reference to that, but I really appreciate this kind of conceptual collapse he does with his work. It seems pretty cyclical in a way. So if you're looking at this series called Sugar Children, it's a photograph of a drawing made with sugar on paper. Okay, so these are portraits, though, of children whose parents or family work on sugar plantations. So he's manipulating sugar on the surface while creating this portrait of this child, right? Who's contextually connected to the material that's making up the representation of her. Not only in the paper being black paper, right, and that has its connotations, but also to race and to the ethnicity of the subject, but also the sugar itself being derived directly from the connection to the living life of this person. That in itself is really interesting, but then also this added layer where the granules of sugar start to speak to the photo document and its relationship to portraiture. So it's got all these formal connections as well to the history of photography and representation through media. It's really got this kind of nice tight wrap conceptually where all the reference are reinforced by the thing itself. And then, so he's also making all these references to art historical representations and artworks. This one is titled Earthworks, where he is manipulating and playing with perception. And so when you're looking at this image, for instance, here, it's really hard to tell if this is a toy truck or a real truck. The line, contour line drawings of objects act as drawings, but they're photographs taken, at least to look like they're taken from a high vantage point. So some of them are taken from helicopters, but some of them are taken on a very small model version of what would look like a desert scene or a landscape, and is rephotographed in an aerial way from a kind of constructed, staged, fake studio arena with artificial lighting and so on. So he's kind of complicating in multiple ways a movement in history we haven't talked about, but these earthworks come out of a series of artists who start to make artworks in the world, specifically in these large-scale, very vacant areas of the world. So you see a lot of artists moving into Nevada, Arizona, these spaces and into these desert areas and making what are called land artworks, huge sculptural installations that either have longevity and live or are subject to nature and disappear. The most infamous of that and artist who worked at this time was Robert Smithson. This is from 1970. This is called Spiral Jetty. This is in Salt Lake, at Salt Lake, and it's an earthwork that you have to actually take quite a journey to get to. It's on the north end of the lake, so you have to really drive out to a very isolated, not very well detailed, and not very well laid out map to this space. So you have to kind of take a meandering journey to what seems like it might not be a real thing, a real space. So part of the adventure is the potential of getting lost or running out of gas or whatever. But you end up driving by a museum where the eastern line of the transcontinental the continental railroad from the east and west met, right? And so there's a space there not far from this called the Golden Spike, where there was actually a solid gold spike that was laid to commemorate the joining of the National Railroad, a line that went completely from east to west coast. And so there's this really interesting historical reference to the journey, the transportation of getting to some of these remote areas, or even the impact of being able to kind of navigate or even dominate the land on some level. But anyway, this jetty that comes out, this spiral, is something you can walk out on, and you see the people there. These people are walking out while the level of the water is high, but when I actually went out there and it was completely dried up, and it's on this kind of interesting cycle of sometimes being dried up and sometimes being submerged completely. But you're invited to walk out onto there, and one of the things that it kind of mimics is one of the bacterias in the lake, and the brine. I forget the type of shrimp. It's a type of shrimp, is one of the only organisms in the lake that can survive the salinity levels, and so it's got this really interesting reference to the color of the chemical makeup when the lake rises like this. It turns this kind of red, which is really fascinating against this larger bluescape. So it's got all these kind of interesting, fascinating connotations, but I like that Vik Muniz is kind of playing with the idea that maybe this was staged, or maybe some of these works were illusions and some type of representation that was created for the image but doesn't actually exist. So he's got some kind of funny play on illusion, but in the sense of our willingness to trust. Okay, so he's making these references, and he even calls to it. He says these are images called Equivalence after Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz is the gentleman I brought up very briefly who photographed Marcel Duchamp's urinal for that exhibition, the fountain. And he's a photographer who's really pushing for photography to become a recognized art form, because at the time, at the turn of the century, he was photography was relegated to a more commercial venture. And so these are his take on these kind of abstract cloud-like images, but they look like things, right? Which is a tea kettle or a dog or a cat or praying hands or a snail or a boat, right? So he's got these equivalents, but they're made out of cotton, right? And so he's got this kind of play on, are you seeing cotton? Are you seeing cloud? Are you seeing equivalent? Are you seeing abstraction? Are you seeing the dog, right? And these kind of playful, I don't know if I can move this. Yeah, I can. Good. So right here I wrote, Equivalence is a series of photographs of clouds taken by Alfred Stieglitz from 1925 to 1934. They are generally recognized as the first photographs intended to free the subject matter from literal interpretation, and as such are some of the first completely abstract photographic works of art. So you can see his kind of, again, play on representation. This is called 16,000 Yards, after the painting by this artist, and he's using yarn to literally trace out, right, or make a stencil like fill of that rendering of that image, and so the reference is there, but it's also again one of those moments where he's asking you to conceptually see the painting, the original, but also acknowledge the materiality of yarn, which is a nod to some of the stuff that we were thinking of and talking about in terms of modernism, right? When do you recognize it as yarn on a surface, right? This image is called Clouds 2001. This is New York City, and one of the things I'd like you to ponder is this a cloud, right? Is this a drawing of a cloud? Is this a representation of a cloud, right? It's got this comical contour representation of a cloud, which clouds don't look like. They look much more like this, right? But when we draw cloud, we represent it, especially in childish ways or in graphic ways. We represent cloud in this way, but it is still cloud because we don't have another term we would really use. We'd look up and we'd say, hey, a cloud, right? And so again, he's playing with language, much like we did when we were talking about introducing our photos of a loved one. Pictures of wire, notice how he titles these. So when you look at this, you might see what looks like a drawing if you came across this in a museum or gallery, but when you look closer on inspection, you see that it's wire that's manipulated and then rephotographed, just like this, which is this really nice play on it being at the same time perceived as a two-dimensional object and a three-dimensional object. Same here, this kind of picture of chocolate action, right? This is good timing after some of the stuff that we just learned. This is Jackson Pollock. This is a series of images he made from dust drawings, I think they're called, or pictures of dust. I think that's what they're called. And he was invited to make some works at I think it was the Museum of Modern Art, and he chose to render drawings of these minimalist sculptures, but he used dust and dirt that he collected from those minimalist sculptures themselves. So in that real space, he went in and over time collected dust and then made these drawings by manipulating dust on them. Just this kind of funny nod to dating the work and the ideas, maybe. And I think that's all I have right there. Okay, so I think that's a good kind of nod to some of the things I'd like you to be thinking about and appreciate about Vik Muniz. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed his work. I think it's really, really intriguing.